Welcome to Historical Currents, where history flows gently, like waves of memory carrying you back to distant eras. In the history of Egypt, some names once blazed brightly upon the throne only to vanish into silence. Faces once revered as divine, whose endings slipped quietly into mystery, their fates uncertain. And there are those whose lives turned toward tragedy, choosing death itself as a final claim to power. These were the queens, the women bold enough to enter a world shaped for men. They were not only wives of pharaohs, nor mothers of princes. At times, they became Pharaoh, seated upon the highest throne, holding the destiny of an empire in their hands. 3,000 years have passed, yet their stories still haunt us. How did they ascend to the throne? What price did they pay to keep it? And what gave their names the strength to outlast the sands of time, so that we still speak of them even today? This is not only the journey of ancient Egypt, it is the journey of power, faith, wisdom, and tragedy. This journey begins with the whisper of the Nile, where each morning the rising sun still touches the ruins of the past as if to retell the story of three of the most powerful queens in Egypt's history. Are you listening tonight, just before sleep? If so, let your eyes grow heavy, let your mind drift free. History is not only a chain of dry dates, it can be a lullaby, a voice carrying you gently into dreams. If these stories bring you a sense of peace, then I am glad. And if you wish to continue this journey with us, consider subscribing so that each new tale will find its way to you. And do not hesitate to leave a few words of your own, for perhaps someone else may discover a quiet harmony in what you share. The sun rises in the east, spilling golden light over the Nile like a ribbon of molten silk. Narrow wooden boats, their prows arched like birds' wings, drift through the waters with unhurried grace. The steady rhythm of oars mingles with the chorus of morning birds echoing across the riverbanks. From the colossal temples that line the shore, incense wafts into the breeze, blending with the river's cool breath. The air feels sacred and weighty, as though every breath brushes against the divine. On the western bank, the shadows of pyramids stretch across emerald grain fields. Beyond them, the desert unfurls in silence, a golden sea of sand, vast and unmoving. Together, Riverfield Temple and Dune form the world, as the ancient Egyptians believed it, the very center of the universe. Here, order was not merely the law of kings, but the god's will. Against that backdrop, one hears the whisper of history. Egypt, the land of rivers, deserts, and pyramids that defy time. Here, supreme power belonged to the pharaoh, the child of the gods, both earthly king and divine intermediary. Every ritual, from donning the red crown of Lower Egypt to the white crown of Upper Egypt, carried sacred meaning. The pharaoh ruled not only by sword and decree, but by the belief that he was the living embodiment of the god Horus. By tradition, the throne was reserved for men, for the sons born into royal bloodlines. And yet across the sweep of millennia, there were moments, brief but seismic, when that order trembled. Not because the gods wavered, but because mortals, armed with ambition and cunning, found cracks in the walls of tradition. From those shadows emerged three names: Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, and Cleopatra. Each carved her own chapter into Egypt's epic. One built monuments and temples as proof of her reign. Another turned faith and beauty into immortal symbols. The last dared challenge an empire with wit strategy and a tragic love that echoed through the ages. But let us slow our pace. Before we tell their stories, we must first immerse ourselves in the world they lived in, an Egypt both prosperous and unyielding, where every law was etched in ritual and myth. In this society, women held a status far above that of many other ancient civilizations. They could own property sign contracts in their name, or even file for divorce or independently run businesses. Such liberties would have seemed inconceivable to the Greeks or Romans of the same era, and yet the throne remained a different matter. That sacred seat was almost exclusively reserved for men, which is why every step a queen took toward that throne was nothing short of extraordinary. It was not merely a contest of power, but a negotiation with the gods, with tradition, and with the weight of millennia of expectation. Strangely, these three women did more than endure that burden. They etched their names into stone, into incense smoke, into the memory of humankind. The Nile still flows, carrying silt, carrying life, to every stalk of grain, every sun-baked home. But this same river bore witness to burning warships' voyages that vanished over the horizon and queens' noble deaths. It is as though each ripple carries a story waiting to be heard. Today, we remember them not only to marvel, but to question. What does feminine power look like in a world ruled by men? Can soft power, wisdom, symbolism, beauty endure like bronze and stone? And perhaps most importantly, how has their legacy reached us across time? These questions will guide our journey. From the sandstone sanctuary of Deir el-Bahari, carved into the cliffside, to the sunlit square of Amarna, where Aten once blazed, to the palace in Alexandria, where a serpent waited in shadow. Each place is a cinematic tableau. Each queen, a soul, both luminous and fragile. The river still whispers under the sun. The imagined boat awaits, and as the first stroke of the oar breaks, the water their stories begin, starting with a young girl running beneath the temple columns who would one day dare to wear the crown of Amun. In the blistering heat of the desert, the towering walls of Karnak rise high, carved with rows of sharp, precise hieroglyphs. Beneath the searing sun, the shadows of colossal stone columns fall upon women presenting offerings, garlands, barley cakes, and small jars filled with precious oils. They kneel, the thin, white linen of their dresses brushing against the sun-baked stone floor. It is an image both common and telling women in ancient Egypt, reverent yet never invisible. Unlike in Greece or Rome, where women were largely confined to the private sphere and seldom appeared in public life, Egyptian women occupied a place of remarkable visibility. They could hold land in their own name, sign contracts, divorce their husbands, and even appear in court as plaintiffs. Surviving papyri reveal widows managing large estates and female merchants trading perfumes in bustling markets. To the eyes of the ancient world, Egypt seemed a strange land where women stepped within the household shadows and into the light of civic life. And yet the pharaoh's throne was another matter altogether. It was not merely a seat of power, but a sacred symbol, bridging the mortal and the divine. The one who sat upon it was believed to be the living incarnation of Horus, the falcon of the sky, who in death would become Osiris, lord of the underworld. Within such a cosmology, succession always favored the male line, securing the unbroken chain of divine kingship. Still, women were not absent from royal power. They appeared under revered titles like God's wife of Amun, a lofty religious office that granted them control over land and temple rights. Others held the roles of Queen Mother or Great Royal Wife, wielding significant influence within the court. At times, when a prince was too young to rule, his mother might govern in his place as regent. But to step beyond that, to move from power behind the throne to sitting upon it, was a dangerous leap. One that required not only intelligence, but boldness. Let us draw a comparison. In ancient Athens, a woman held no citizenship, no right to vote, and could not own land independently. But in Thebes, surviving records tell a different story. A widow could sell property or lease boats to transport goods. In Rome, noble women were legally bound to their fathers, husbands, or male guardians. Yet in Egypt, a female merchant could set prices in the marketplace. That contrast, the fertile ground of Egyptian society, created the rare opportunity for three queens to rise and assert their power. But let us not mistake this for true equality. Egyptian reliefs and sacred texts etched one truth into stone: the pharaoh was male. For a woman to claim the title of pharaoh, she had to adopt the image of a man wearing the false beard, donning the crown, and addressing herself in masculine terms. It was a dual performance, an assertion of her singularity, and a concealment of her female identity. Perhaps this is the quiet tragedy of female power in the ancient world. To be accepted, they had to become something else, another version of a man. And this very tension between feminine selfhood and masculine symbol forged figures both magnificent and fragile. In that world, one can imagine a young girl running through a colonnaded garden, her breath quick, her small feet skimming over cool stone. One day, that child would place the crown of the god Amun upon her head and proclaim herself pharaoh. Her name was Hatshepsut, and her story would mark the beginning of an epic journey shared by three queens. In the heart of ancient Thebes, where temples rose like a forest of stone, there was a garden small, secluded, and reserved for the royal family. There, morning light filtered through towering colonnades, falling gently on date palms and the soft wild herbs growing between the flagstones. A little girl ran barefoot across the cool stone path, her laughter echoing through the vast stone halls. She was the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I. Her name was Hatshepsut. In that world, she was more than a child at play. Each day, as she passed beneath the statues of the gods Amun and Mut, she learned to bow before the sacred. The priest told her that her father was not just a king, but the living Horus, son of the gods. In her young mind, Hatshepsut gazed at him with awe and harbored a quiet question. Why did the gods choose only men? Most Egyptian princesses grew up to become royal wives, tokens of diplomacy through marriage. But Hatshepsut was different. Adored by her father, she was allowed to learn hieroglyphs and read sacred inscriptions etched into stone, an uncommon privilege for a girl. While princes trained with weapons in the courtyard of Karnak, Hatshepsut watched the rituals in silence, how priests recited spells, how offerings were counted and recorded. From these scenes, she began to grasp a truth that power did not lie only in the sword ceremony and belief. When she reached womanhood, Hatshepsut was married to her half-brother, Thutmose II, a union meant to preserve the purity of royal blood. Her husband was frail and often in ill health. But this too opened a strange door. Hatshepsut became not only the pharaoh's wife, but the true force that managed the court behind the scenes. Perhaps those childhood days in the Garden of Columns, beneath the shadow of temples and the murmur of prayers, forged her boldness. In a society where the throne was nearly untouchable for a woman, Hatshepsut learned early that if ever the chance came, she would have to wear the guise of a man to be accepted. But for now, she was still just a little girl running in the shade, listening to the trickle of water from the canal that fed the garden, dreaming of a world far larger than she knew. Stories tell that her father Thutmose once took her to construction sites where giant stones were hauled up ramps, while rows of laborers sang to keep rhythm. Hatshepsut didn't see stone as mere material. She saw permanence. Even as a child, she understood stone endures longer than flesh. Perhaps that was when the seeds were planted for the eternal monuments she would later leave behind. Within the palace, Hatshepsut learned the subtle art of diplomacy. She listened to the officials, observed how negotiations unfolded, and watched their eyes flicker as they bowed. She was not born to rule, but she remembered everything as if waiting for a time when it would matter. Little survives from her early years, but scattered traces from carved stelae temple walls reveal a girl trained far beyond the norm for women of her time. Modern scholars believe that this preparation gave her the confidence after her husband's death to step forward not just as a regent, but as pharaoh in her own right. As the evening sun slanted across the Garden of Columns, Hatshepsut would sit beneath the statue of Amun, her gaze drifting into the distance. She could not yet know her fate, but the stillness of stone and the solemnity of the temple had already become her silent companions. One day, she would claim that she was the daughter of Amun, divinely chosen to rule. But it all began here, in the garden of her youth, where laughter mingled with the chime of stone and the scent of resin on the wind. And so begins the tale of one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. From the girl in the Garden of Columns to the queen who wore a false beard, the journey was both improbable and inevitable. The next chapter will reveal the turning point, the untimely death of Thutmose II and Hatshepsut's rise from queen consort to regent and eventually sovereign. By the time Hatshepsut reached adulthood, the palace at Thebes was no longer a quiet garden. It had become a chessboard of power. She was married to Thutmose II, her half-brother. It was not a union born of love, but of royal custom, a means to bind the bloodline and legitimize the succession. Thutmose II was frail, his health fragile, and his reign brief. Upon his death, the heir Thutmose III was still a child. According to tradition, in such times, the queen would assume the role of regent, ruling on behalf of her son until he came of age. That is how Hatshepsut began, seated behind the throne while the royal seat remained symbolically reserved for Thutmose III. In early reliefs, she was depicted simply as king's wife and mother of the king. But over time, the imagery changed. Hatshepsut began to appear alongside the pharaoh, holding the crook and flail. Gradually, she adopted a title that had been the domain of men for centuries, Pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt. This was an unprecedented leap. Before her, a few women had briefly ruled like Sobekneferu, but none had built a lasting reign. Hatshepsut charted a new path. She did not merely safeguard the throne for her stepson, she claimed it for herself. To do so, she anchored her authority on religion and symbolism. She declared that she had been chosen by the god Amun, his beloved daughter. The powerful and wealthy priesthood of Thebes stood behind her. During the Opet festival, when the sacred bark of Amun was carried from Karnak to Luxor, the crowd surged, drums pounded, and the bearers of the bark tilted the god's shrine, a movement interpreted as Amun's divine nod. That moment was immortalized in stone. Amun had chosen Hatshepsut, but ritual alone could not sustain her rule. She built a loyal network around her. Hatshepsut, the high priest of Amun, became her spiritual pillar. Senenmut, a devoted official and tutor to Princess Nefertiti, was entrusted with the treasury and royal building projects. With these allies, Hatshepsut wove a sophisticated political web, which many stood to gain if she remained on the throne. Yet to be recognized, she had no choice but to wear the guise of a man. Statues of Hatshepsut show her with a flat chest, false beard, and the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Under the flicker of torches, her silhouette stretched across the temple floor, masking the truth the pharaoh was a woman. This tension, the genuine authority of a woman cloaked in the image of a man, made Hatshepsut's presence utterly singular. She broke the mold even as she appeared to reinforce it. During her regency, Hatshepsut consolidated power through soft policies. Unlike many male pharaohs who favored military conquest, she chose to build temples, statues, and expansive trade networks. Under her hand, Egypt entered a period of prosperity and stability. Grain fleets from the south arrived on time. The jewel workshops of Thebes glowed with firelight. Markets filled with the scent of resin and cinnamon. To the people of Egypt, such abundance was proof that the gods were pleased. At a grand court assembly, sunlight poured through the high ceiling of Karnak's great hall. A shaft of gold touched the throne, where Hatshepsut sat, draped in a robe embroidered with gold thread. Beside her stood young Thutmose III, small, almost like a shadow. The court bowed not to the boy, but to the woman who had dared to call herself pharaoh. No one used her old titles anymore. From this moment forward, she was Matkari Hatshepsut, the manifest truth of the god Ra. In temple inscriptions, she repeatedly emphasized that she ruled by the will of the god and for the benefit of her son. It was a deft political strategy, asserting her power without appearing to usurp it. She never removed Thutmose III, but kept him under the shade of the throne so that one day, when her time ended, he would inherit a strong and orderly empire. Yet that very decision would later sow the seeds of tragedy. When Thutmose III came of age, he would have her name chiseled off many monuments. But at this moment, this brief interlude, when Hatshepsut crossed the threshold from regent to ruler, no one could foresee that ending. Through masterful tact, she slipped out of the female regent role and emerged as a true pharaoh. And to seal that transformation in eternity, she launched her most ambitious project, the Temple of Deir el-Bahari, carved into the sandstone cliffs, a declaration in stone. That will be the next chapter in her story. On the west bank of the Nile, where the sun sets behind towering sandstone cliffs, a great worksite began to ring with the clang of hammers and the tightening creak of ropes. White dust rose into the air, the scent of freshly cut stone mingling with the sweet resin drifting from nearby temples. Beneath the blazing sun, lines of laborers hauled multi-ton blocks, their footsteps pulsing like the beat of a sacred drum. Their chants echoed off the cliffs, the mountains responding with a chorus of their own as if the rock was singing. There's something unprecedented in Egypt's history took shape. The temple of Deir el-Bahari, Hatshepsut's enduring masterpiece. Unlike the sharp peaks of pyramids built by her ancestors, she envisioned a structure carved into the mountain itself. Broad terraces, colonnaded rows, and long open porticos basking in sunlight. The temple resembled a monumental staircase from a distance rising from the dusty valley floor toward the blue heavens. Its design carried a dual purpose. To the people, it was a sanctuary of Amun, a sign that the god had blessed the reign of a female pharaoh. But to Hatshepsut, it was something more, a proclamation in stone. She was not a placeholder. She was pharaoh in truth, and her right to rule would be etched forever into the earth and the cliffs. Behind its design stood Senenmut, the trusted official who once tutored Princess Nefertiti. He organized thousands of workers, overseeing builders, architects, and master sculptors. The temple's columns and walls became more than a structure. They became a monumental scroll narrating her story. On those surfaces, Hatshepsut carved divine myths of her birth. How Amun, disguised, came to her mother, and thus a pharaoh was born. Every carved line was not only an offering to the gods, it was a message to the future. Her power was the will of the divine. Deir el-Bahari was also Hatshepsut's testament to her prosperity. Across the reliefs, she depicted her famed expedition to the land of Punt ships with full sails, bearing incense, exotic animals, rare woods, and gold. Through these images, she made her statement clear. Her reign was not merely legitimate, but flourishing. Egypt, under her hand, had expanded its reach, and wealth had followed. One morning, as the temple neared completion, the sun rose red over the horizon, its rays falling directly upon its sweeping terraces. The workers paused, watching light poured through the colonnades, bathing the entire structure in gold. It was a sign to them the god Ra had marked his approval. In that moment, Deir el-Bahari was no longer merely stone and sand. It symbolized immortality. When the temple was finished, Hatshepsut held a grand dedication ceremony. People came from across the land, bearing garlands, barley cakes, and musical instruments. The valley rang with drums, reed flutes, and voices raised in song. The pharaoh emerged, dressed in white linen, wearing the blue-crowned scepter in hand. Before the god Amun, she offered a sacrifice and spoke a prayer, her voice echoing off the cliffs. Every eye was fixed upon her. She was a woman, but no one dared call her regent queen any longer. She was pharaoh, and the temple was her proof. Curiously, many temples in later centuries would attempt to emulate Deir el-Bahari, yet none would achieve its harmony between mountain stone and light. It was not only a place of worship, but a cinematic landscape cast in eternity where architecture, nature, and power merged into one. And yet the temple did not face only the cliffs. Its reliefs showed sails filled with wind and distant seas, as though the temple pointed outward toward a journey beyond Egypt's borders. And indeed, after inscribing her power into stone, Hatshepsut was preparing for the greatest expedition of her reign, a voyage to the fabled land of Punt, realm of incense and gold. The sun rose over the harbor of Thebes, gilding the Nile's waters in light. On the banks, teams of workers moved swiftly, pulling ropes, lifting crates, the sharp sound of wood striking wood echoing across the quay. A fleet of large ships was moored and ready, their prows elegantly curved, their thick wooden planks fastened with copper nails. Tall masts bore white linen sails already catching the morning breeze. Incense smoke from a ritual to the god Amun curled above the decks, blending with the rhythm of pounding drums. But beneath the din was a guiding force, Hatshepsut. She had commanded the fleet's assembly, turning this journey into a declaration of power through commerce, not war. The land of Punt had long stirred the Egyptian imagination, a distant realm known for its fragrant resins, exotic animals, precious woods, and gold. Many pharaohs had sent expeditions, but Hatshepsut sought more. To her, this voyage was not merely trade. It was living proof that under the rule of a woman, Egypt remained prosperous, expansive, and divinely favored. As the sails filled with wind, the fleet pushed off, cutting through the waters. On deck, provisions were stacked high, barley cakes, dried fish jars of water. Scribes carefully logged the diplomatic gifts prepared for Punt's people: copper bracelets, bronze daggers, beads of colored glass. Every item had meaning, and on the riverbank, Hatshepsut stood, eyes fixed on the departing sails. She carried no sword, but she had turned her fleet into a weapon of peace. The journey was harsh. The ships followed the Nile, crossed marshes, and sailed into the Red Sea. Salt winds burned skin waves, rocked the masts, and the sun scorched the decks. Yet in this hardship, the sailors whispered to each other, "We go for our Pharaoh, for the queen who made the whole nation believe that Amun himself approves." That belief became their anchor. When the fleet finally reached Punt, they found a world unlike Egypt. Incense trees shaded the coastline. Houses stood raised on wooden stilts, and the air was thick with the scent of myrrh. The people of Punt came to greet them, dark-skinned, clothed in coarse linen, bearing gold and bundles of aromatic resins. On the walls of Deir el-Bahri, Egyptian artisans later carved these scenes: round-bodied Puntite women, tall stilt houses, rows of amphorae brimming with fragrant goods. The reliefs were not merely records of trade, they were tributes to Hatshepsut, the pharaoh who reopened the path of prosperity. Negotiations began. The Egyptians offered copper rings, daggers, and glass beads. In return, they received ebony gold and precious resins. Most notably, they brought back living myrrh trees, roots, and all a logistical feat of great ambition. These saplings were to be planted in the gardens of Amun's temple at Thebes. With this act, Hatshepsut made her message clear. The prosperity she brought home was not fleeting, but something that could take root in Egyptian soil and flourish with her reign. On the day the fleet returned, Thebes erupted like a festival. Cheers rang out as the ships docked and the air filled with the scent of hundreds of jars brimming with resin. Gold gleamed in the sun. Rare woods were stacked in grand piles. Children ran alongside the procession, and grown men reached out to touch the spoils of peace. Amid the crowd, voices chanted Hatshepsut's name. They understood Egypt's wealth was no accident. It was the result of a pharaoh's vision, a woman's leadership that had brought home such treasures. On the cliffs of Deir el-Bahri, Hatshepsut had the entire expedition carved in stone. But there were no battle scenes, no images of conquest. Instead, she immortalized sails unfurled in the wind, Puntite emissaries, bowing goods overflowing. It was the triumph of peace. She wanted future generations to see under her rule, Egypt grew strong, not through bloodshed, but through commerce, faith, and diplomacy. That vision marked a bold contrast with her male predecessors. By turning trade into a form of glory, Hatshepsut redefined what it meant to rule. She laid the foundation for the idea that a female pharaoh was not lesser, but capable of securing a prosperity that weapons could not. In this moment, when Dir el-Bahari gleamed in the sunlight and the scent of Punt's incense filled Thebes' Hatshepsut reached her zenith. A woman once destined only to be wife and mother had become the bringer of abundance and the architect of a new vision of power. But history is seldom kind. Even as songs of triumph echoed through the streets, shadows gathered elsewhere in the palace. Loyalists of Thutmose III viewed the voyage not with pride, but with resentment. A woman had carved her name too deeply into the stone and the people's hearts. And so, from the glory of Punt, the story darkens, turning toward a more somber chapter, when her name would be chiseled out of the monuments she had built. Years after the voyage to Punt, Hatshepsut departed the throne forever. Her death came quietly, without the grand funeral rites recorded for other pharaohs. The woman who once made the Nile bow now remained within her tomb's darkened chambers. And as she vanished, Thutmose III, now a seasoned king, with the gaze of a hardened warrior, stepped fully into power. At first he continued what she had built a stable, Egypt overflowing treasuries, monuments that pierced the sky, but gradually a quieter task began. Stonecutters and artisans, the hands that once sculpted Hatshepsut's likeness in praise, now used their chisels for a different purpose. In the flickering shadows of temple workshops, the glow of oil lamps danced across carved walls. A sculptor raised his hammer and struck her face, once immortalized in stone, shattering it into fragments. On temple walls, her names were gouged out, scraped away, replaced with images of Thutmose III, or left eerily blank. Some statues were demolished. Others were buried beneath layers of sand. It was a systematic campaign, as if history itself was trying to deny her ever existed. The reasons remain debated. Some believe Thutmose III harbored resentment still stung by her having once claimed the throne meant for him. Others see a calculated political move, an effort to restore the illusion of an unbroken male lineage, uninterrupted by a female pharaoh. Whatever the motive, the result was unmistakably tragic. Hatshepsut was erased from Egypt's official memory for centuries. Only jagged stone remains in the temple of Dir el-Bahari, where the vibrant reliefs once celebrated the glorious voyage to Punt. Worshippers still visit, incense still burns, and the rituals continue. But the image of the pharaoh who once brought those offerings from distant lands is forced into silence. The scars in the stone remain like wounds that will never fully heal. That silence lasted for millennia. In the official lists of pharaohs, Hatshepsut's name did not appear. Egyptian scribes spoke only of Thutmose III, the great conqueror of the Near East, the builder of an expansive empire. The female pharaoh had become a shadow left unnamed, her legacy unwritten. Yet there was one thing Thutmose III could not erase: stone. Though partially defaced, the temple of Dir el-Bahari still clung defiantly to the cliffside. The towering obelisks at Karnak still pierced the sky, even half buried in sand. And within the stones themselves, in the surviving carvings and broken fragments, traces of her name remained, glyphs not entirely scrubbed away. Marx is waiting silently for someone in the future to uncover. The image of a woman, Pharaoh, faded from the collective memory of ancient Egypt, but not entirely. In folk tales, whispers lingered of a queen who had built a temple into the mountain. In the memories of stonecutters, passed down through generations, perhaps a trace of pride and unease remained. They had once carved the face of a woman who ruled as king. More than 2,000 years later, when dust and ruin had long claimed the valley, Western archaeologists arrived. They found fractured walls, shattered statues, and lines of hieroglyphs violently defaced. And they began to ask who was once honored here. Why was their name removed? From the shadows of stone, the name Hatshepsut began to stir again. In the irony of history, the campaign that tried to erase her forever turned her into one of Egypt's most studied and storied pharaohs. The name that had been chiseled out became for that very reason even more enduring. Thutmose III had silenced the stone, but the stone never forgot. 3,000 years later, just when the desert seemed to have buried her completely, other hands, those of archaeologists, began tapping on the door of time. And from the silence, Hatshepsut returned. The site was in ruins, blanketed in dust and sand. But as the debris was cleared away, faint carvings began to emerge, fleets of sailing ships, scenes of Puntite emissaries bearing fragrant goods, lines of hieroglyphs half erased. The explorers were puzzled. Nowhere on their lists of Egyptian rulers did the name Hatshepsut appear. And yet, in the grooves where chisels had faltered, in the fragments of stone that time had spared the name, slowly revealed itself like a secret buried for millennia. That discovery ignited a question. Who had ruled here, and why had they been erased from history? In the 20th century, the search for answers reached new heights. A tomb was uncovered in the Valley of the Kings, KV-20, long and winding, its corridors descending deep into the earth. Within it, a massive stone sarcophagus bore the name of Hatshepsut, but the mummy was gone. The mystery only deepened. How could a pharaoh who once ruled so powerfully simply vanish? Where had her body gone? And why had it been removed? In 1903, archaeologists uncovered two female mummies within a modest tomb, KV-60. One lay in a coffin bearing the name of a royal nurse. The other, unnamed, rested silently on the stone floor. For decades, no one paid much attention to the anonymous body. It was stored away in the archives of the Cairo Museum, a shadow waiting for the day it might be called by name. It wasn't until the early 21st century that modern science illuminated the mystery. Researchers used CT scans and DNA analysis, and then quite by chance discovered a small wooden box inscribed with the name Hatshepsut. Inside was a single tooth. The fit was perfect. When tested against the jawbone of the unidentified mummy from KV-60, as the X-ray image lit up the screen, the research team fell into stunned silence. Hatshepsut had been reunited with her body after 3,000 years. The moment played out like a poignant scene from a film, X-ray light illuminating the faces of the archaeologists, the small wooden box cradled in hand, and on the screen, a perfect match between tooth and bone. One tooth had bridged a queen to her past, breaking the silence of centuries. Today, when visitors walk through Deir el-Bahri, they see rows of white columns pressed against the mountainside, many still bearing the rough marks of chisels, scars from the campaign to erase her. Yet those scars are what give the temple its solemn majesty. They tell a story not only of power, but of erasure and of resurrection. In the museum today, the statue of Hatshepsut false beard, and all stands proudly once more, a spotlight cast upon her face. On the placards beside her, she is no longer labeled female regent, but Pharaoh Hatshepsut. Once denied her authority, the woman has had her honor restored, now recognized as one of the most well-known pharaohs in all of Egypt. There is a paradox here. Her erasure made her extraordinary. Had Thutmose III not attempted to remove her from history, her name might have remained a mere footnote among the kings. But because she was silenced, because it took modern archaeology to resurrect her, Hatshepsut is now known worldwide. No one can deny her anymore. As sunset casts its crimson glow across the cliffs of Thebes and light shimmers along the colonnades of Deir el-Bahari, visitors no longer see only a stone structure. They witness a resilient memory. A female pharaoh once struck from the record returned from silence to live again through science, art, and the imagination of humankind. And so, the chapter of Hatshepsut draws to a close. But the Nile still flows, and from another shadow, a new figure prepares to emerge, Nefertiti, the mysterious woman whose immortal face lives on in limestone. In the winter of 1912, desert winds crept into the cracks of sun-dried brick walls in the barren village of Amarna. A team of German archaeologists worked quietly inside an abandoned sculpture workshop, once belonging to the master artisan Thutmose, the chief sculptor of Pharaoh Akhenaten's court. Oil lamps flickered, casting long shadows as figures bent low over the dust. Then they lifted a block of limestone from a dim corner, veiled in the dust of 1,000 years. As the final grains fell away, the room fell silent. A face emerged, high-bridged nose, delicate chin, lips curved in a faint smile, and eyes gazing slightly off to some distant horizon. It was Nefertiti. The bust, barely half a meter tall, instantly became one of the most iconic images in the world. It was hailed as the perfect beauty, a face that defies time. But to stop at beauty is to miss its deeper meaning. From the moment it was carved in Amarna, this sculpture was never just art. It was a political statement. In Thutmose's studio, the bust had once served as a model for apprentices. Yet this was no ordinary likeness. The master sculptor had not merely carved a face, he had shaped a symbol of soft power. Nefertiti holds no scepter, a pharaoh wears no warrior's crown. Instead, she dons the tall, smooth blue crown, striking in its simplicity, yet regal in its presence. No weapons, no proclamations. And yet, through her gaze alone, through sheer presence, she commands attention. It was a new kind of power Egypt had never seen before. But it is the eyes that haunt most. One socket holds a quartz inlay, catching light like a living eye. The other remains empty, half present, half absent, as though Nefertiti is still watching us, and yet already withdrawn from this world. This incompleteness made the bust legendary, a beauty, not in perfection, but in mystery. Powerful, precisely because it is unfinished. The world stood in awe when the bust was brought to Berlin and placed on display. Crowds pressed close to the glass case, newspapers sang its praises, and writers and artists drew endless inspiration. In that moment, Nefertiti, the woman who had vanished from historical records, came alive again, not through words, but through her face. Yet with that resurrection came a quiet question. Who was she? we have the perfect face, but the story behind it has faded. Her origins remain unclear. How she entered the royal court, became queen, and disappeared from the chronicles of history remains shrouded in mystery. There is a strange irony here. With Hatshepsut, we have inscriptions, monuments, and a tomb, but her face was destroyed. With Nefertiti, it is the opposite. We have the immortal face, but the narrative is hollow. One is stone with words, the other stone with form. Both whisper to the future, but in two different languages. Today, visitors enter the round room where the bust stands in the Neues Museum in Berlin. Through the glass, they meet her gaze. Many pause for a long time, as if under a spell. Some whisper that it feels like she sees through them, even though they know she is only stone. That gaze poses a challenge. Where does Nefertiti's power lie? In her beauty, in the religion of Aten, or in her ability to command the eyes of future generations? The bust doesn't tell the full story, but opens a door. Behind that eternal expression lies a life, a woman who once stepped into royalty, shared power with a pharaoh, led a religious revolution, and then vanished. So the sculpture is not merely a beautiful face. It is a threshold, an invitation into the next part of the journey, the story of Nefertiti, the woman who emerged from the shadows and became queen of the sun god Aten. Her name, Nefertiti, means the beautiful one has come, and yet, in one of history's great ironies, her arrival is cloaked in shadow. No surviving record tells us where she was born or who her parents were. She entered the royal court as if from thin air, and within a moment, she became a radiant presence beside the pharaoh. Some scholars suggest she was the daughter of a high official who would later become Pharaoh himself. Others believe she may have been a foreign princess from Mitanni, a northern kingdom. Both theories are compelling, but neither is certain. The only truth we hold is this: Nefertiti emerged from the haze of ambiguous records to become a central figure in the Egyptian court. In the palace at Memphis, where the young pharaoh Akhenaten was still forging his power, Nefertiti appeared like a rising star. Ritual drums echoed across tiled floors, incense curled in plumes from Aten's altar, and the scent of resin mingled with the drone of long trumpets. Into this solemn rhythm stepped a young woman, her posture upright, her crowned tall eyes elongated with dark kohl. Courtiers and royal kin murmured, then fell into hushed reverence before her presence. It wasn't just her beauty, it was her aura. From the beginning, Nefertiti showed she was no passive figure behind the throne. She did not stand in Pharaoh's shadow. In early ceremonies, she stood beside him. In the later reliefs carved at Amarna, we see the two seated as equals, offering gifts together to the god Aten. It was a scene without precedent. Previous queens had appeared at the periphery, mothers' consorts never sovereign presences. But Nefertiti was rewriting the script. At the time, the Egyptian people must have looked on with awe and curiosity. Some whispered, "Is she merely the king's wife or something more?" Yet whatever doubts there were, Nefertiti's presence was swiftly sanctified. In hymns to Aten, her name often appeared beside the pharaohs, as if the two stood together as divine intermediaries between the sun god and humankind. What made Nefertiti remarkable was the fusion of beauty and political acumen. Her beauty made her unforgettable. Her intellect made her indispensable. The nobility regarded her with reverence, perhaps even fear, while common folk spread stories of the beautiful one who has come, treating her as a sign of divine favor. But her rise was more than the personal ascent of a royal consort. It coincided with a tidal shift in Egypt's spiritual order, a direct challenge to the entrenched power of Amun's priesthood. In Thebes, those priests held wealth and influence. Yet Akhenaten and Nefertiti turned toward a new faith, Aten, the solar disk. Her equal presence beside the pharaoh during Aten's first great ceremony signaled that this was not merely a queen, but a co-architect of a religious revolution. In the early festivals of the sun, commoners packed into public squares, watching as the queen raised her hands in salute to Aten. She stood boldly not behind her husband, but absorbing the divine light in her own right. The sun's rays caught the smooth blue crown atop her head, setting her figure aglow. For the people, it was a sight unseen. A woman appearing not just as queen, but as a vessel of the divine. This is why her limestone bust, capturing a serene, soft majesty, still mesmerizes us. It isn't just the elegance of her features. It is the trace of an era when Egypt allowed a woman to stand alongside its king at the summit of power. Nefertiti stepped out of the shadow into the light, radiating a presence that was impossible to ignore. And in that light, she didn't just stand beside the pharaoh, she began to walk alongside him. At times, she even stepped ahead. From that moment forward, Egypt's royal court witnessed something unprecedented, a pharaoh who shared both his throne and his vision, with a woman bold enough to claim it. When Akhenaten decided to elevate the god Aten above all others, the foundations of the Egyptian court trembled. It was more than a religious reform. It was a revolution against the old order built on the power of Amun's priesthood in Thebes. And in that rising wave, Nefertiti did not stay behind. She stepped forward, sharing the throne alongside the pharaoh. The surviving reliefs at Amarna show scenes never before seen in Egyptian art. Nefertiti is seated equal to Akhenaten. Their hands lift offerings for Aten together. No longer just the queen, she is portrayed with the proportions of a pharaoh in her own right. In some reliefs, she, not the king, bestows gold upon courtiers. In others, she appears smiting enemies, a role traditionally reserved for male pharaohs. These scenes sent a message. Egypt now had two flames shining together. Akhenaten, the visionary, and Nefertiti as a partner in power. In the Aten ceremonies, the court stood under the unshielded sun. There were no dark temple halls with massive stone columns like Amun's. Instead, wide open spaces. Light struck directly down, and the sun's rays fell upon reliefs where carved hands reached toward the sky, ending in the symbol of the Ankh emblem of life. Akhenaten and Nefertiti stood there, hands raised together, as though both were conduits between gods and humanity. The people witnessed this and were both shocked and deeply moved. They saw a queen not relegated to the margins, but standing boldly, receiving Aten's light alongside her pharaoh. To them, Nefertiti was more than royal wife. She was a force equal in divine power. And there was another layer in that partnership love. The reliefs do more than record ceremonies. They show private moments. Akhenaten and Nefertiti are seated together. Children are playing at their feet, and a tin sun disk is shining down upon the family. Such intimacy starkly contrasted with traditional royal imagery, where the pharaoh was often distant, raised above all. This showed a reign built not just on religion, but also on visible emotional union. For Akhenaten, Nefertiti was not a shadow, but a companion. For Nefertiti, this was her chance to turn beauty and presence into a foundation of political power. Together, for that short time, they redefined the Egyptian throne. However, this shared power was not without its challenges. By elevating Aten and sidelining Amun, they struck at the priestly class, controlling much of Egypt's wealth and rituals. In Thebes, the temples of Amun grew quiet, incense smoke thinned. The priests looked toward Amarna, the new capital the pair were building, with resentment burning in their eyes. Under Aten's blazing light, Nefertiti's authority was established and unveiled before the people. She became co-ruler in truth through religious symbolism and formal ceremony alike. At one Aten festival, the square thundered with drums and trumpets. Thousands squeezed together, sweat dripping in the blistering heat. But when they raised their eyes, they saw more than a ritual. They saw two figures, Pharaoh and Queen, together atop the high terrace, arms raised in unison. It wasn't just a religious moment to the people. It was proof that Egypt now had two sharing the throne. This union led Egyptians to name the era with a special title, the Amarna period, an epic not ruled by a single pharaoh, but by a pair of lovers, allies, prophets together. From this point on, the story is not simply of a woman walking beside a king. It becomes a story of a new capital, religion, and worldview, Amarna, the city forged in the brilliant light of Aten. When Akhenaten and Nefertiti resolved to build a new capital, they weren't merely planning another royal city. They were declaring a revolution. They left Thebes, the aging stronghold of Amun, and sought a blank canvas on the Nile's east bank amid sand and rugged rock, on a land where no city had ever stood. Here, under the all-seeing gaze of Aten, they would begin anew. They named the city Akhetaten, Horizon of Aten. Even the name carried cosmic weight, the place where the sun rises, where light touches the horizon. On the scorching sand, thousands of builders and laborers toiled without rest. Hammers rang out, white dust fluttered into the sky. Sun-baked bricks were laid in long ranks. Carts creaked beneath the burden of timber. Everything was pressed forward in a hurry. Amarna rose like a waking dream in less than 10 years from an empty desert. This city was unlike any capital before it. Streets ran straight. Open plazas stood under the open sky. The temples of Aten were built to receive light, not hide it. Gone were the shaded columns, deep shadows, incense-hung halls of Karnak or Luxor. Amarna flaunted its rituals in sunlight, every altar, every offering exposed to the blazing sun. The great temple of Aten stood at its heart, a vast structure so wide that ceremonial processions passed through it without obstruction. Long sacrificial tables bore incense, lotus blossoms, bread, meat, and wine. Above Aten spread its rays, ending in the symbol Ankh, life, shining down upon Pharaoh and Queen. But this time, the people did not watch from afar. Amarna was not built for secluded priests alone. It was a stage open to all. When Akhenaten and Nefertiti built their palace, it was more than stone walls and halls. It was a mirror of their philosophy. On its walls, reliefs showed their family, the royal couple playing with their 6 daughters under the shining Aten. It was a scene unseen before. In Egyptian art, the pharaoh, not as a distant god, but as father and husband living in the light of divinity. The impression must have been overwhelming and strange for those entering Amarna for the first time. They walked along straight boulevards, across sunlit squares with no roof, and saw pharaoh and queen in public view, not hidden in temple shadows. They saw a new court, a new faith, a new way of life, all of it exposed, radiant, transparent, like the sun itself. But that very transparency bore fragility. Amarna stood brilliant and vulnerable under the scorching sun, and the judgment of history without shaded colonnades to shelter them, without dark halls behind which to hide. The city was like a bold dream, magnificent, but with an unspoken sense that it might not endure forever. Yet in that brief span, Amarna became the capital of light. Akhenaten and Nefertiti appeared together from the palace balcony, looking over the people hands raised beneath a tent. For them, this city was more than a residence. It was proof that power could be rebuilt from the foundation with new beliefs and images. Today, when archaeologists uncover the remains of Amarna, the broken mud bricks, fragments of family reliefs, relics of a dream only partly realized, they reveal the skeleton of a great being once alive. But if you close your eyes, you can still hear drums, trumpets, and see the shadows of 2 figures standing together under the sun. Amarna, the city of the sun, stands as the peak of Nefertiti's story. From this point onward, she was more than the immortal face carved in limestone. She was part of an entire new world, the world she and the pharaoh dared to build from the dust. And from here also began a turning the brighter the light, the deeper the shadows. Nefertiti's disappearance was drawing near. The city of Amarna shone bright beneath a tent for only a short time. Then something strange happened. Nefertiti vanished from history, leaving almost no trace. No official record records her death. No tomb is confidently known to be hers. No mummy can be identified as Nefertiti. From being present in every ceremony, from her face paired with the pharaohs in reliefs, she suddenly seems to have slipped off the earth. Theories about what happened to Nefertiti are many and varied. Some believe she died early, before the reforms of Aten were complete. Others suggest she didn't die, but changed her name, ruling briefly under a pharaonic title, perhaps as Nefer-Neferuaten, a ruler whose identity may overlap with hers. Some scholars hold that she withdrew from power, giving way to successors and fading into obscurity. These ideas persist because the evidence is so scarce. After year 14 of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti's name no longer appears in temple inscriptions. Reliefs that once depicted her have been defaced or altered. Even in the Great Aten Temple, where she once stood beside Akhenaten, there are bare stretches of wall-cold erasures where her image once stood. Historical silence can be more chilling than destruction. With Hatshepsut, we can read the scars. The chisel marks the rage in later inscriptions. With Nefertiti, there are almost no scars left, just absence, a disappearance without explanation. That very absence makes her one of ancient Egypt's greatest mysteries. Archaeologists have periodically believed they found her tomb. In 2015, the Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves provoked excitement by proposing that Tutankhamun's tomb may conceal a hidden chamber, a place that might be Nefertiti's final resting place. The speculation made headlines. Radar and thermal imaging were deployed. For a moment, hope surged, but the results were inconclusive. The secret remained sealed behind stone, as though Nefertiti had chosen silence. This silence creates a paradox. The fewer the proofs, the more alive the imagination of those who follow. Some imagine Nefertiti dying quietly buried, hastily in an unfinished tomb. Others believe she remained upon the throne under another name, ruling until Tutankhamun took over. Each hypothesis is like a shattered mirror reflecting a different face of the same woman. Yet perhaps it is in her disappearance that Nefertiti became immortal. She was never confined to a single ending, never sealed away by history's final mark. Instead, she endured as the embodiment of mystery, a door that is never fully closed. And when one stands before her bust in Berlin, its missing eyes staring into eternity, they glimpse the reflection of something unfinished, a queen radiant with glory, whose story was left suspended mid-breath. In that silence, one still hears the echo of Amarna distant drums. A family happy beneath Aten's rays. A woman who once stood beside and at times even ahead of the pharaoh. Whether history chose to forget or fate forced her into silence, Nefertiti remains in stone and in the fascination she inspires. And so her ending is not a period, but a space left open to those who come after. A space large enough for each generation to write its own image. But if we stopped here, Nefertiti's story would be merely a mystery. In truth, she left a legacy that fills every gap, not in tombs or mummies, but in image and faith in a teen. That is the part of her story that deserves telling next. Nefertiti vanished from the records, but her form never truly faded. Instead of leaving behind a tomb or mummy, she left two things: a religion that once shook Egypt and an immortal face. In the brief moment of Amarna Aten stood at the center of the cosmos, Nefertiti did not merely stand beside Akhenaten in ceremony. She with him forged a new belief that sunlight is the source of life and the royal line is the bridge between gods and humans. The surviving reliefs show her raising her hand to catch Aten's rays, which is equal to the pharaoh's. That was different from tradition. For ages, the pharaoh alone embodied the divine. But in Amarna, the people saw the queen share that light. Even though Aten's reforms collapsed swiftly, the image of Nefertiti under the sun marked a turning point. In that moment, she stood beside the pharaoh in collective memory. Her second legacy is her image. In 1912, the bust discovered in Thutmose's workshop shook the world. The faint smile, high cheekbones, long neck, the solemn blue crown, and the eyes, one finished, the other left empty. More than a century later, that sculpture still sits in Berlin's museum, one of Earth's most viewed works of art. People often call it perfect beauty, but the power of the bust lies in more than beauty. It is Nefertiti's statement of soft power. While many pharaohs left colossal monuments. She needed only a face, and that face was enough for humanity never to forget her. The statue also says something else. Her story never truly ends. The missing eye, the head turned slightly, and the incomplete smile make the sculpture feel unfinished business. Like Nefertiti's life, her ending was erased, leaving a gap for the imagination. This incompleteness makes her immortal, not confined to a specific ending, but forever an open mystery for those who come after. Today, when one enters the Neues Museum in Berlin, many fall silent before that gaze. Some see gentle beauty, some a queen, exalted others the emptiness of a story unfinished. But all agree, this is not merely art, but a door into a lost age. In comparison, Nefertiti's legacy differs from Hatshepsut's. If Hatshepsut affirmed her power by towering temples, Nefertiti affirmed hers by an image by belief. One left stone was inscribed with words, and the other left stone was carved into a face. Both prove that women could imprint on history even if their paths were different. And in this lies the variety of female power in ancient Egypt. Some leave monuments, some leave faith, some leave political wisdom. Through 3 different paths, they all enter the memory of humankind. In the end, Nefertiti did not need a tomb to endure. She lives in the bust in memory, in the faith of Aten that once blazed bright. And from that immortal gaze, history opens toward another name, the final Queen of Egypt, who will use wisdom and cunning to challenge the mightiest empire of that time, Cleopatra. Alexandria rises like a freshly cut jewel where the Nile meets the Mediterranean. It became Egypt's gateway to the Greek world, founded by Alexander the Great, and then handed to the Ptolemaic dynasty. And in the city's heart, its greatest pride was the library holding hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls, a gathering of humanity's knowledge. In that atmosphere, Cleopatra was born. In 69 BC, she arrived in the Ptolemaic royal family, a line of Greek origin that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Greek blood ran in her veins, but she was born beside the Nile, listening to Egyptian songs, breathing in the incense from temples of Isis. Unlike many princesses before her, Cleopatra's childhood was luxurious and scholarly. They say she knew at least 7 languages: Greek Egyptian, Hebrew Arabic, Syriac Parthian, and Latin. Rarely had a Ptolemy before her learned and spoken native Egyptian, a language even her ancestors did not master. Through speech, she touched the hearts of her people. One morning, in the library of Alexandria, soft light slipped through the window frames. Papyrus dust floating voices reading in many tongues. Cleopatra, still young, in a long hallway, walked with measured steps, her hand brushing lightly across scrolls stored in wooden chest cases. She learned Homer, Herodotus, mathematics, and astronomy from ancient Egyptian teachers. Books were part of her youth as much as the throne awaited her future. That intellect made her different from her sisters in the court. If they knew Greek feasts and music, Cleopatra loved hours of reading, studying, and practicing debate. Palace advisors say that even as a child she spoke with few words but unforgettable impact. This gift for rhetoric would become her sharpest political weapon, rivaling even the strength of armies. With its bustling harbor and the great Pharaoh's lighthouse, Alexandria was where Cleopatra grew up. She matured in the convergence of cultures, Greek and Egyptian, East and West, knowledge and power. It was here she became a queen who combined beauty, learning, and political shrewdness in one. But the Ptolemaic throne was not a gentle gift. It was a throne lined with daggers. Cleopatra understood this clearly. Her dynasty had been torn apart by sibling rivalry, and blood dyed the throne many times. In the history scrolls in Alexandria's library, she read stories of her ancestors. Whoever won became pharaoh. Whoever lost was exiled or killed. Perhaps that is why Cleopatra worked so hard, not only at learning, but at the arts of persuasion, diplomacy, and calculation. She knew in the Ptolemy court, the clever survive, the naive perish. The Egyptians remember Cleopatra as a woman who was both beautiful and wise. But beauty is only the surface. It is the intellectual foundation shaped in Alexandria that was the real weapon. A girl raised among books and the sea fluent in her people's speech, able to charm when needed and to strike when required. That was Cleopatra. In the larger picture, Cleopatra was the final product of ancient Egypt and a bridge to the Mediterranean world ruled by Rome. And the knowledge she absorbed from Alexandria's library would become a tool by which she faced some of the greatest powers of her age. But before confronting Caesar or Antony, she faced enemies inside her family. The game for the Ptolemaic throne never allowed weakness. It was here, in the shadows of plotting, that Cleopatra first tasted the merciless nature of power. In the Ptolemy family, the throne was never a peaceful inheritance. It was a merciless chessboard where siblings, brothers, sisters, and even children were ready to kill to sit on the gilded seat. Cleopatra, even as a young girl, saw this in her ancestors' faint, blood-stained images. When King Ptolemy XII, her father, died, the throne passed to Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was only about 10 years old. Under family law, they had to marry to rule together, but behind that marriage was a political gambit. In truth, only one could hold the full reins of power. Cleopatra quickly proved herself to be in control. She was clever, both strict and gentle. She stepped into the public eye, speaking to her subjects in Egyptian, something no Ptolemy before her had done. This won her the love of the people, but also stirred jealousy at court. Ptolemy XIII and his advisors, especially the general Pothinus, could not accept a woman, even his sister, overshadowing their authority. They began to build factions, defame Cleopatra, and spread rumors that she was too close to the Egyptian people and betrayed her Greek heritage to win popular favor. The court became a silent arena. In Alexandria's marble halls, factions whispered in corners, passed messages, and offered bribes. One day, Cleopatra realized her avenues were being narrowed. Supporters disappeared. The treasury doors closed to her. Then, an official decree arrived. Cleopatra was deposed. The news spread beyond the palace in just a few hours. In Alexandria's markets, fishmongers froze in their work. Grain traders whispered, "The queen has lost power." Some rejoiced, seeing it as a victory of pure Greek blood. But others were fearful. They knew Cleopatra was the only member of the family who dared to speak Egyptian to her people. For Cleopatra, that blow was both bitter and illuminating. She understood the rules of her family: the weak vanish. But inside, her anger and will ignited. The throne was snatched from her hands, yet no one could steal her intellect or cleverness, things she had honed since childhood. At that moment, Cleopatra made a silent vow. One day she would return, not merely by bloodline, but by intellect that rose above those who oppressed her. They say she left Alexandria in a small flotilla, bringing only a handful of loyal supporters. The Nile's waters were dark, the wind fierce, as if mirroring her destiny. From a princess scholar in the library, Cleopatra became a queen in exile, not yet 20 years old. But this was not the end. In defeat, she revealed another strength, the ability to wait and to turn the tide. Cleopatra did not flee forever. She established herself on the borders, summoned allies, and rebuilt her forces. In private banquets, she consulted with generals, her eyes sharp, her lips still smiling, and her voice firm. This throne shall return to me. Meanwhile, Alexandria teetered in chaos. Ptolemy XIII was too young, puppeteered by court advisors. The people were divided, fear of the Ptolemy faction longing for Cleopatra. Markets buzzed with rumors. Merchants shook their heads over rising taxes and shifting laws. There was no one in the court with enough courage to reassure. Instability grew. Just then, a giant silhouette appeared from the West Rome. The civil war between Pompey and Caesar had ended with Pompey's death on Egyptian soil. To restore order, Caesar entered Alexandria with his seasoned legions. To him, Egypt was a pawn on the Mediterranean chessboard. But for Cleopatra, it was a golden opportunity. She knew she could not defeat the Ptolemy faction by her small force alone. But she had something else: intelligence, persuasion, personal magnetism. If she could make Caesar see her, not as a piece but as a partner, the throne might open again. The bloody game of the Ptolemy dynasty, already cruel, was now placed on a grander board, where Rome played the commanding role. In that moment, Cleopatra stood at the cusp of the greatest act of her life, her meeting with the mightiest general of the era. And from that meeting, Egypt's fate would be changed forever. In 48 BC, Alexandria was in turmoil. Pompey had just been assassinated on an Egyptian beach. His body was delivered to Ptolemy XIII as a boast. But when Julius Caesar arrived, he showed no satisfaction. He frowned, not only because Pompey had been an enemy, but also because once a co-power in Rome. His murder was not just an insult. It was a sign the Ptolemy dynasty was recklessly overreaching, and now Caesar would decide Egypt's fate. In the palace at Alexandria, Caesar pitched his camp. He was not a visiting guest, but a conqueror. Marble walls reflected torchlight. Roman boots sounded an echo down hallways. Ptolemy XIII and his courtiers trembled, seeking to please Caesar even while fearing his dominance. In that moment, Cleopatra saw her chance. From exile, she plotted. She could not approach Caesar openly. Ptolemy's forces would stop her, perhaps kill her, before she crossed the gate. She needed a bolder path, an unexpected entrance that none could block. And so, she devised her plan. Conceal herself in a rug, roll herself up, and be brought into the palace as a gift. That night, the sea outside the harbor rumbled softly. Cleopatra and a loyal servant approached wrapped in thick linen. The servant bore the heavy package, slipping past gatekeepers and Roman guards who glanced casually, unaware. Each step felt weighted, for exposure meant death. Inside the linen, Cleopatra held her breath. The smell of cedar wood and fresh fabric pressed against her, her body crammed, unable to move. The servant's steps staggered, her heart pounded as if the world could hear. Outside, a Roman guard glanced briefly. Some laughed, believing a luxury item was being gifted. They did not suspect that hidden within the roll of cloth was not gold or treasure, but the blood wager of a young queen. Inside the palace, Caesar sat upon his seat, his red cloak deep, his face still hardened by the Pompey affair. When the gift was laid at his feet, the cloth unfurled, and Cleopatra stood, not adorned in regal finery, but a young woman, eyes shining with resolve. In that moment, history held its breath. Caesar looked at her, and she looked at him. No need for many words. The boldness spoke for her. I am prepared to stake everything to enter this game. The Romans record that Cleopatra was more than beautiful. She had an unusual magnetism from her intellect presence and strong and soft voice. She spoke in Greek, the language Caesar understood. She did not beg. She stated plainly that she was the rightful queen, her throne stolen, and only Roman justice could restore it. Caesar listened, then smiled gently. In his eyes, she was not merely an Egyptian girl, but someone wise enough to recognize that the balance of power had shifted into Roman hands. And it was that very candor that sparked his interest. The next day, Caesar ordered that Ptolemy the King Florentine be summoned. The 13-year-old boy and his courtiers entered in the great hall, expecting to continue their domination. But they did not anticipate Cleopatra standing by Caesar's side. The Ptolemy faction froze. Caesar declared that he would adjudicate the struggle for the throne, and both siblings must heed Roman authority. The declaration rolled out like thunder. Ptolemy's courtiers trembled, their faces ashen, as they realized Roman favor had turned toward Cleopatra. Beyond the palace walls, the news spread through every street. Markets buzzed. Some rejoiced, some trembled. All perceived the shift Alexandria would never be the same. From that moment, Cleopatra ceased to be a queen in exile. She became an ally, at least for now, of the most powerful man in the world. To many, this was astonishing. To her supporters, it was hope. To her rivals, it was the stirrings of fear. From that meeting, not only would the throne be reshaped, but in the exchange of glances. Inside the Alexandrian palace, a bond invisible tightened a bond both of rescue and of danger. It would draw Cleopatra and Caesar close and sweep all of Egypt into a vortex of ambition and emotion that could not be separated. From that moment, the carpet was rolled back, and Cleopatra's fate became entwined with Caesar's. Their alliance began as a political strategy, but soon transcended the cold calculus of power. In the early days, Caesar made camp in the palace at Alexandria. The corridors echoed with Roman soldiers, yet also with their late-night conversations. Cleopatra did not appear like a distant queen, but as an equal adversary. She analyzed Egypt's chaos and spoke of suffering under Ptolemy people crushed by taxes. Caesar listened, nodded, and gradually realized she yearned not only to reclaim her throne, but to steer the nation's destiny. Cleopatra knew well that to sway Caesar's charm alone would not suffice. She showed him Egypt not merely as a fertile land, but as the breadbasket that fed Rome. She spoke of the Nile's rhythm ships laden with grain sailing toward the Mediterranean and incense and gold flowing in trade. Each word was a move on a chessboard laid before Caesar helper, and he would gain a prosperous ally in the gateway to Africa. Yet in their dialogues, what touched Caesar most was not the strategy, it was something more elusive. He saw in Cleopatra a rare magnetism, not merely her beauty, but her vitality, her intelligence, the way her gaze could both listen and challenge. Plutarch records that her voice was pleasant, that she could speak many tongues, that her presence was compelling. In the palace of Alexandria, night after night, they spoke, debated, then dined together. Greek wine mingled with music, played on Egyptian instruments, and incense drifted in the sea breeze. In that strange setting, the conqueror of much of Europe now sat opposite an Eastern queen, and between them, political scheming wove itself together with growing intimacy. The alliance quickly turned into action. Caesar declared that Cleopatra would be restored to the throne. A war erupted within Alexandria. Ptolemy the Thumpertine's forces clashed with Roman troops and Cleopatra's supporters. The streets became battlegrounds, rooftops burned red, and the clash of swords echoed through the city. Amid the chaos, the Library of Alexandria also suffered. Some of humanity's accumulated knowledge was lost to flames. After months of fighting, Ptolemy the Thumpertine perished, his body pulled from the Nile. Cleopatra reclaimed her throne, no longer a solitary queen, but now a ruler with Rome at her back. The people of Alexandria cheered, yet they saw the truth in their celebration. Egypt's fate was now bound to Rome. Inside the palace, Caesar and Cleopatra became a public pair. She bore him a child, naming him Caesarion Little Caesar. The boy became a living symbol of two worlds, united, half Roman, half Egyptian. Yet beneath the surface of love, politics remained the dominant force. Cleopatra knew she needed Caesar to keep her crown. Still, in the throes of Rome's civil wars, Caesar needed Egypt's grain and gold. Every touch, every glance was both genuine and calculated. Still, it was undeniable. They found what both had been missing in each other. Caesar, long accustomed to intrigue and betrayal, saw in Cleopatra intelligence and loyalty. Cleopatra, raised in a family steeped in bloody power games, saw a force strong enough to shield her and Caesar. Emotion and strategy became inseparable, and the lines between love and power were forever blurred. When the winds shifted, Caesar departed Egypt, taking with him both victory and the memory of Cleopatra. Yet, in Alexandria, the queen was no longer merely a shadow behind the throne. She had proven bold enough to step into the grandest game of her time, but fate would not let her hold on to that power for long. A few years later, Caesar fell, struck down by daggers in the Roman Senate. The news reached Alexandria like a blade across the heart. Cleopatra lost her most powerful protector, and Caesarion, their child, suddenly became a dangerous symbol in the eyes of Rome's ambitious rivals. Amid the turmoil, a new name entered her life: Mark Antony, a famed general and Caesar's trusted ally. He had risen to become one of the three men dividing control of Rome in the fragile power pact known as the Second Triumvirate. And from the lavish feasts held in Alexandria, a new alliance was born, passionate, fated one that would lift Cleopatra to a fleeting peak of glory before casting her into the twilight at Actium. After Caesar's death, Antony and Cleopatra openly stood together in Alexandria. Lavish banquets transformed the eastern capital into an unprecedented spectacle. Tables laid with silver and gold wine flowing in rivers' reed pipes, intertwined with Egyptian instruments. They declared themselves Dionysus and Isis, merging love and politics into a shared dream, as though Alexandria might rival Rome. But that very extravagance became the weapon of their enemies. In Rome, Octavian Julius Caesar's heir launched an intense propaganda campaign. He told the Senate, Cleopatra had not just beguiled Antony, but sought to move the empire's capital from the Tiber to the Nile. In the imagination of Romans, the Eastern Queen became the embodiment of danger, and Antony, the traitor, blinded by love. Caesarion, the child of Cleopatra and Caesar, was also seen by Octavian as a mortal threat. The boy could contest the throne if acknowledged as Caesar's legitimate heir. So, Octavian resolved to seize Rome. He must dethrone Cleopatra. Actium was no longer just a naval battle. It was the final act in a campaign of words and shadows that had already won hearts and minds in Rome. In 31 BC, two fleets faced off in the Gulf of Actium. Antony sat in his encampment clad in gleaming armor, his eyes heavy with foreboding. Many Roman officers deserted him for Octavian. Cleopatra stood beside him, her gaze deep, her voice steady. We will live or die together. The vow was gentle, yet irrevocably fated. On that morning, the sea at Actium was a blaze of sunrise. Over 400 warships are arrayed in formation. The wind-filled sails, the campaign drums thundered, and pine resin from oars drifted across the waves. When the fleets collided, prows struck with thunderous crash. Flaming arrows soared and embedded in wooden decks. Fire erupted, black smoke coiled high. Cleopatra commanded the Egyptian squadron at the rear, her ship marked by a violet sail ablaze. Antony led the vanguard, directly confronting Octavian's fleet under Agrippa. For a time, battle was fierce, sword clanged on sword. Ship rammed ship, blood reddened the wave faces. The cries of men rose among the clash of steel like a mournful song. Then the fateful moment came. Amid a battle not yet decided, Cleopatra suddenly ordered retreat. The purple sail ship turned, and the Egyptian fleet pulled back from the fight. Antony stood on deck, helmet gleaming in the firelight, stunned as he watched. He raised a hand meant to stop her, but in that moment of despair, he abandoned his troops and leapt aboard Cleopatra's ship. Morale collapsed at once. Antony's forces broke. Octavian seized the moment, and Agrippa pressed the attack. Warships burned. Timber cracked in explosions, bodies drifted over smoky waves. The cheers of the enemy drowned out the cries of Roman soldiers left behind amidst the smoke. On the ship, speeding through the wind, Cleopatra stood silent, her hands gripping the mast. Antony stood still beside her, eyes turning backward toward the sea ablaze, a funeral pyre for an empire. He had chosen to follow her, but that choice meant the death of his Roman power. Octavian watched from his flagship, face cold as stone. He knew this victory was not won merely by sword and fleet, but that the long months of propaganda had paved the way. Actium was his coronation by war, but also by narrative. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, the fleet in tatters, soldiers broken. The truth was clear inside her. There was no more chance after Actium. Yet her eyes still held fierce light. If she could not reclaim the throne by war, she would leave the game by her own choice. The Battle of Actium entered history as the naval clash that decided the ancient world. But in Cleopatra's memory, it was more a blazing sunset where love and power sank together. And from that dusk emerged a final act, tragic and immortal, in Alexandria's golden halls. After Actium, Alexandria was no longer a brilliant capital. The streets that once glowed by torchlight fell silent. Egyptian warships were shattered, the treasury drained. People walked across the squares, hearing the distant footsteps of Roman soldiers, hearts full of fear. Yet fear was not all that filled the city. There was also regret. Folks remembered those radiant days under Cleopatra and Antony festivals, marketplaces overflowing with goods, docks crowded with ships. Now, the plazas held only wind-empty stalls and wary glances. An empire that had once shone had decayed before its people's eyes. Inside the palace, Cleopatra was locked between gilded walls. Antony, once a commanding general, was now broken. He would sit for hours without speaking, staring out toward the sea, as though watching the ghost of his lost fleet. Sometimes he raged, sometimes he sat still as a fractured stone. Cleopatra watched him, her heart heavy, knowing that Antony's faith had been consumed in the fire of Actium. Octavian advanced from the south. As the Roman legions closed on Alexandria, Antony learned he had been betrayed. He believed Cleopatra had secretly made terms with the enemy. In despair, he drew his sword and took his own life. They say that when he was brought to Cleopatra, blood still flowed from his chest. She held him in her arms, her cry caught in the sealed room. Antony took his last breath. Cleopatra remained, but her world had collapsed. That night, Cleopatra did not sleep. She paced through the palace, touching every wall and every golden vessel, as if remembering these for the final time. Before a bronze mirror, she saw hair loose and disordered eyes dark with sleepless nights. Yet in her gaze there glimmered pride. If Antony had fallen, she would choose a different path, so that the name Cleopatra would never be dragged in shame. After Antony's death, Octavian entered Alexandria. He did not immediately order her death. He needed the Egyptian queen brought to Rome to prove his victory. But Cleopatra understood that meant humiliation. She, descendant of God-incarnate pharaohs, would never consent to be a prisoner in a triumphal parade. She prepared for death as one prepares a ritual. Cleopatra, dressed in white robes in the golden chamber, wore the Uraeus cobra crown on her brow. Beside her were two loyal handmaidens. They say that a venomous snake was hidden in a basket of fruit, a symbol of Egypt's protective goddess. Cleopatra lifted her hand at the final moment, so the serpent could crawl up her bare arm. The venom seeped into her skin and a cold spread. She reclined on her couch, eyes closing, lips still holding a vague smile. It was more than death a choice. If she could not rule as queen, she would depart as a goddess. When the Roman soldiers burst in, they found Cleopatra motionless, her robes pure and white gold light cast gently across her peaceful face. Beside her lay the faithful handmaidens who had followed her to the end. Octavian stood and watched his face unmoved, but in his heart he knew that Cleopatra had escaped the humiliation he had planned for her by that death. The death of Cleopatra marked the end of more than 3,000 years of pharaohs ruling Egypt. From then on, Egypt became a province of Rome, but her image did not sync with the dynasty. On the contrary, that final moment made Cleopatra a legend. To the Romans, she was a symbol of allure. To the Eastern peoples, she was remembered as a queen who dared to choose her own fate. Across centuries in paintings, statues on stage, and film, the death in the Golden Chamber still haunts humanity because it was not merely a tragedy of love, but the ultimate affirmation of a woman who faced the world. Alexandria still heard the sea's lapping waves beyond its walls in the final silence. But inside the palace, that golden chamber became an immortal marker where a queen chose to leave not as a prisoner, but as a legend. The death in the golden chamber ended a dynasty, but it opened a legend. Cleopatra was gone, but her name never left mankind's memory. Already in that very century, Octavian, now called Augustus, understood that his greatest enemy was not Antony, but the image of Cleopatra. In the eyes of the people, she was more than a woman. She was an ideal, intelligent, daring, and charming, altogether able to humble even the most powerful man. So, Octavian sought to rewrite her story. In inscriptions and propaganda, Cleopatra became the Eastern witch, a figure who used beauty to corrupt Antony. Yet that very defamation ensured that her name would never vanish. In Roman times, historians and dramatists were afraid and fascinated by her. Plutarch acknowledged that Cleopatra was not the blazing beauty of legend, but her presence was irresistible. Others wrote that she was the personification of Egypt, a fertile but mysterious land enchanting even the strongest. From then on, Cleopatra's image began to live a second life as a symbol. She appears in many guises in art: a solemn queen on Roman murals, a temptress in Shakespeare's plays, a beauty icon in Hollywood films. Each era, Cleopatra is reborn in its own way, but always with one thing in common: she cannot be forgotten. What made Cleopatra different was not merely her appearance or her famous romances. Above all, she was a politician. She learned to speak the people's tongue, something never seen before among the Ptolemies. She made Egypt a power that could not be ignored on the Mediterranean chessboard. And in her final years, she still held the power to choose her fate even when pushed into corners. The image endures: a woman who dared to choose death rather than allow her dignity to be stripped away echoes even today. It reminds us that in the ancient world where power belonged mostly to men, there were women bold enough to change the game's rules. For generations, Egyptian folk have still told the story of the last queen. To them, Cleopatra was not simply a ruler who failed, but a symbol of unbowed pride. Lamps were lit at night when news of her death spread by tradition. These lights were signs that people saw her as part of the very soul of their land. In European culture, Cleopatra became an obsession. From the Renaissance through the 19th century, painters painted her in that golden chamber, a serpent coiled around her arm, light bathing her form. Each painting was an act of imagination, yet all honored that final moment as a proclamation. Even in the modern age, Cleopatra remains on screen in novels and opera. Whenever one speaks of female power, people think of her. When beauty and intellect are spoken together, people remember her. When love and politics entwine in tragedy, people turn to her story. Her greatest legacy is not in victories or monuments, but in her immortality within human imagination. She proves that a life, even one brief and ending in tragedy, can leave a mark beyond time. So when we close the story of Cleopatra, we do more than recount the life of an Egyptian queen. We speak of a symbol that bridges past and present from the winding Nile to the stages and screens of the modern world. Among the three mighty queens of Egypt, Cleopatra was the last. But through the very tragedy of her passing, she also became the one who lives longest in the memory of humankind. In Egypt's over 3,000 years of history, the throne was rarely meant for women. Yet three names rose not only to rule, but also to imprint three very different roads to power on human memory. Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, and Cleopatra are three women in three ways the world remembers. Hatshepsut left a mark as solid as stone. She turned her power into temples and trade things you can measure, touch, and stand before. Looking back, people do not merely see a woman as a pharaoh, but as an architect of prosperity. She built to prove her existence, and those monuments, sea routes, and trade networks became evidence instead of words. In Hatshepsut, power is recorded in carvings and numbers, the steady breath of a stable era. Nefertiti chose a different path, beauty and belief. She did not build with massive stone, but with light and faith. Her face became the measure of beauty, and the rituals of Aten became the stage where that image spread. If Hatshepsut shows us the strength of a system, Nefertiti shows us the power of a symbol. When face and belief become one, power can reach beyond the borders of a reign. Her mark is proof that beauty too can be a tool of politics, and often an image lasts longer than a dynasty. Cleopatra stepped onto the scene at the very end of Egypt's independence, and her road was one of intellect and tragedy. She did not rely merely on images or monuments, but on her ability to converse with the world, to speak many languages, negotiate and twist the board when needed. But that intellect collided with Rome's immense power. She became the protagonist in a tragedy where death did not erase a name, it made it immortal. Cleopatra proved that failure can also become a legacy if one turns an ending into a choice. Three queens, three paths. One carved power in stone and trade. One carved power in face and faith. One carved power in words and final tragedy. No two alike, yet all three share one thing. They turned the limitations placed on women into their own language of power. And because of that, they were not swallowed by the currents of history, but became three different echoes on the Nile's bank, three ways human memory cannot forget. If Hatshepsut reminds us that a woman can make history through persistence and governance, then Nefertiti shows that they can shape the idea of beauty and the sacred. And Cleopatra reminds us that even in defeat, a woman can hold her agency and leave a story that is uniquely her own. Put side by side, those three paths form a complete triangle: endurance, beauty, tragedy. They do not exclude, but illuminate each other. And that triangle shows that female power in ancient Egypt was not merely a random exception, but a possibility always present, waiting for opportunity to reveal it. But those echoes do not stop at the banks of the Nile, because in other lands, in other centuries, people also witnessed women rising to thrones and leaving marks all their own. And then, when we lift our gaze beyond the Nile, history shows that echo does not stay in place. In the West, Elizabeth of England ruled in an age rife with religious storms and foreign threats. She did not need a husband to secure the throne, but turned her solitary status into strength, the Virgin Queen, a symbol that tied her entire realm to her image. In the North, Catherine the Great of Russia rose from foreigner to empire builder, ruling with an iron hand, yet giving rise to an age of enlightenment. In the East, Wu Zetian of China stepped beyond the role of regent to claim the title of emperor, asserting that ultimate power does not necessarily belong to men. Those names are not repetitions of Egypt, but different echoes of the same ambition, the ambition to hold power and leave a mark. Looking back, we do not see a straight line, but scattered points of light from the Nile to the Thames, to the Neva, to Chang'an, all proving that in every civilization, women can step out of the shadows to become the center of history. And perhaps that is why the three queens of Egypt still carry weight today. They are not global templates, but the first echoes. When we hear stories of Elizabeth, Catherine, or Wu Zetian, we realize that the history of women in power is not isolated, but a harmony resonating across millennia. Dusk falls on the Nile. The water carries hues of gold and red, then slowly washes into violet. Birds fly low, and the sound of oars upon the river is a distant melody. The river still flows, bearing memories of dynasties long faded. Some kingdoms shone, and names that were erased, but in the whisper of the waves, one still hears the echoes of those extraordinary shadows, unnamed yet recognizable. They once wore crowns, stood between light and dark, forced the world to pause and listen. And so those three figures, each by her own path, have merged into human memory. No longer just the story of Egypt, but part of a shared epic about power, desire, limits, and transcendence. Night deepens, the Nile still flows. It has flowed for 5,000 years and will continue flowing. Just like these stories, still to be told, remembered in the desert wind, by a flickering lamp, or in a voice that carries in the stillness of night. Thank you for spending this moment with us. May these stories bring peace to your night and comfort to your mind. Sleep gently.